has over a decade of experience working in technology and learning, having occupied different roles, learning technologies, researcher, and recently as a manager. So Dan, without further ado, it's up to you, and looking forward to your session.
Thank you, Mary. Hopefully everyone can hear me and should be able to see my slides. Hopefully we won't get any more technical gremlins as we progress through. Thanks very much for the introduction. This session is very much going to be about digital accessibility, more specifically digital accessibility and the impact of the global pandemic. My role at the University of Kent involves managing a team of learning technologists, and digital accessibility it's something that is born out of my interest in what I see as these conflicting discourses around digital accessibility at the moment and the rapid shift into online delivery. It's probably worth noting as well that I undertake this piece of work largely from the perspective of perhaps being a PhD student rather than from my professional capacity as an e-learning manager at Kent. The two do complement each other and work together, but I've sort of come at this from the perspective of my PhD research. So this session, without further ado, is largely focused on data that I've been gathering from UK universities over the past 2 to 3 months, and I'll talk more about the methodology that I've followed in a second. I'll give a brief reminder in this session of the regulations that are driving a lot of this work around digital accessibility, and then I'll explain in more detail why I think this catalyst distraction question is actually an important one to ask, and why I think we need to apply a degree of caution in our work in this area, particularly as we look to automate accessibility. We're going to look at some of the data from around the UK and how the sector responded, and what sort of trends there might be as well in that data. And then finally, to end the session, I'll try to summarize this work and try and offer some thoughts on how we might be able to begin reconceptualizing digital accessibility in the midst of this pandemic, and hope to be able to stimulate some discussion in this area and perhaps offer some practical advice too. So if all goes well, I should have some time at the end for some questions as well. So let's get cracking. I should note as well, I think Martin was going to point this out, because I am presenting some data in this presentation, I do kindly ask that people refrain from photographing or screenshotting or sharing that data outside of this session. Any slides with data on, well, you'll know which ones they are because they've got a little icon that I've popped into the corner. So if you could follow that, that would be absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much. Okay, so I've lost my mouse, so I can't progress the slide. There we go. There's those technical gremlins. So just a brief note about the methodology that I've used to follow here. It's worth noting that the data informing this work is largely a combination of different sources, from FOI to discussions with colleagues at other institutions, and also a lot of information that's actually already out there on the public web, on university websites, and from other sources online. So in total, I've combined data from around 100 institutions in the UK. So here's a very brief reminder of where we're at in terms of the regulations that are driving a lot of work around digital accessibility. I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with these. The public sector bodies accessibility regulations, or PSBAR as I'm going to refer to them in this presentation, they were introduced in September 2018, and these regulations actually permeate all areas of university life, but it's the inclusion of the VLE and the requirement for captions in pre-recorded video that I think very squarely placed the implementation of such compliance at the feet of teams like mine. And this is broadly mirrored across the UK in that it tends to be TEL teams that are absorbing the lion's share of this work. Now, it's worth me noting at this point that digital accessibility is nothing new, and these regulations predate COVID. Okay, so, but what the regulations did is that they placed a higher emphasis and a sharper focus on digital accessibility at an institutional level, And so what I'm interested in this presentation is to see the effect that the global pandemic had when it struck. So in March, back in 2020, well, still in 2020, back in March, I was sitting in a room with various colleagues from around the university, and we were working through all sorts of contingency plans for action planning around the continuity of teaching delivery and online examinations and access to technology and all the sorts of conversations you were probably having at your own institutions. And a now former member of the University of Kent's executive group turned to me and said, Dan, you and your team must have been waiting for this day. And it was said in good humour from someone that knew the challenges my team had faced over the years in getting academic colleagues to engage with digital learning. But it did make me think in that moment, have we really been waiting for this day? And the reason I say that is the pace of change in higher education is glacial at times, and sometimes for good reason as well. But this was very much the antithesis. We were about to embark on some of the most rapid changes higher education had ever experienced. And my fear in that moment was, in such rapid change, things get forgotten, things get left behind, and the actions that carry the broadest impact are often the actions that get prioritized. It's natural. And unfortunately, the narrative is that accessibility has been habitually regarded as this afterthought. And my concern was that the pandemic may actually resurface this mindset and actually undo a lot of the good work that we've done. And until that point, we felt at Kent that we were actually in quite a good place. We've been trying to mainstream accessibility for some time, and I've been working really closely with my colleague Ben Watson on this. Under the sharper focus of the PS bar, we had executive group putting their name to communications and putting accessibility front and center. We prepared guidance for staff to follow, and we were actually in the process just before March of putting together some training for staff that we hoped would have been mandatory for all staff. And in addition to that, we also had the tools to support this work. So you'll see that we have Blackboard Ally, and we had closed captions, automated closed captions. We were the first Moodle-based institution to adopt Blackboard Ally back in early 2018. So we had these tools that underpinned this. And so with all this work that we were doing, we felt, well, COVID, it felt like a real distraction for us, but both in terms of the focus of our work, but in simple resourcing terms, in that the energies and the efforts and the channels of communication for all that human aspect of digital accessibility were just in an instant absorbed by our broader response to the global pandemic. And perhaps the most concerning element here, the thing that I found most concerning, was that at that point, the institutional outlook on digital accessibility suddenly shifted to, well, thank goodness for Blackboard Ally, and thank goodness we've got those captions in place, because at least we're meeting our obligations, which I was a bit disappointed with. And at that point, I believed, and so did others, that we placed far too greater reliance and emphasis on this notion of automated digital accessibility. And all the competing demands of COVID just removed the human from the process. I mean, I'm talking grand terms here, but I really did feel that we were removing the human from the process. And just as we've done with plagiarism and academic integrity, so this is nothing new, we automated and systematized a process that starts and ends with human interaction in some form. And it's almost as if automation was seen as the resolution to this problem. It would solve the issue. As Sharon Flynn noted earlier, this notion of creeping automation. I would argue that automation alone can actually be quite damaging, because it lulls us into this false sense of security and into neglecting our responsibilities as content creators. Don't get me wrong, because I'm conscious there's Blackboard people in this call. I think Blackboard Ally and tools like automatic speech recognition are absolutely fantastic, innovative, amazing technologies, but they only work well when they're part of a suite of activities. So as time went on, I saw all of this noise as this huge distraction, and it felt like it was at odds with a lot of the literature that I was reading and seeing in early summer. So there were quotes like this one taken from the university's UK blog, in which people were extolling the virtues of the global pandemic as this catalyzing event, and one that would suddenly make us sit up and pay attention to the accessibility needs of our students. And the JISC Learning and Teaching Reimagined report, where the word opportunity is noted no less than 28 times. Now, I don't mean to come across dismissive or cynical here, because I'm not. I agree that there are opportunities to come out of the global pandemic, but I frankly disagree with the notion that somehow the pandemic is this great level. I've heard it referred to as this great level numerous times, and I think that's a dangerous discourse to follow. And if you dig a little deeper, you can see that the rapid move to online delivery, it's not all equal, and the sector is actually falling short. In the Arriving at Thriving report, it noted that a quarter of students surveyed felt that their courses were inaccessible in relation to digital resources. And then the NADP practitioners report on COVID highlighted numerous issues around digital resources, access to technology, and the overall lack of awareness amongst academic staff and digital accessibility. At Kent, the picture was very similar. So in a recent study, one student commented that the subtitles of my recordings are useless. There are loads of errors in them. Another student noted that the audio quality in their lecture recordings was really, really poor. There was further comments from a visually impaired student saying that the module guides simply would not work with their screen reader technology. And one of the quotes that I found most interesting is this final one, which is from a student that said, whilst it's really good captions on my recordings and being able to download my readings as an MP3, the Moodle module is a complete mess. It takes me an age to find things and to navigate through the content. It really doesn't help that files and resources don't even have sensible names. And this, to me, indicated two things: that automation is no panacea. So the presence of automated captions and the presence of format shifting software doesn't guarantee anything. But it also demonstrated that from an institutional point of view, we were just not getting the basics right. So distraction or not, there was still plenty of work for us to do. So if we move on to looking at some of the institutional data, or the sector data, I should say, the first question I asked as part of my research was whether an institution undertook any work specifically in the area of digital accessibility because of the pandemic. And out of those 101 institutions that responded, 73% indicated that they had. Now, some did note that it was probably quite difficult to disentangle whether this was a direct result of the pandemic or just continued work towards the PS bar. But broadly speaking, institutions appear to have reacted and been reactive to the pandemic in some form or another. And when we drill down into this data more, we can see that there's two obvious trends. So when we ask the institutions to provide details on the work that they undertook, you can see the two obvious trends are around providing more enhanced guidance for their academic staff and their professional services staff. But this huge 30% chunk of people purchasing format shifting software such as Census Access or Blackboard Ally. And for this question, respondents were able to list as many items or issues as they liked, and which I then coded and categorized and have summarized here. And it's fascinating in the responses to see the number of institutions that said things like, well, we were already looking at Blackboard Ally, but we decided to purchase it earlier than planned. Again, another question that I asked, and again, this one is a little harder to disentangle from the broader work around PS bar, but is whether institutions had seen an increase in the number of academic related queries since March 2020, specifically around digital accessibility. And the majority of institutions where that data was available acknowledged that yes, we believe there has been a ramp up in the number of queries. But again, this becomes more interesting when we explore the qualitative responses here. And the elaborations on these responses is perhaps more telling in that it indicates that almost half of the queries received related to the use of automated accessibility technologies. You could argue this goes either way, perhaps indicates that these technologies are catching the attention of academic staff, or conversely, they might be surfacing inaccuracies and sapping academic time to correct them. Speaking from a Kent point of view, that we've seen a huge ramp up in queries recently, specifically around automated captions and who does the editing of these captions? Do I have to edit these captions? Why are is it not getting the particular terminology correct, and things like that. It's also worth noting, I highlighted in the slide here, that some of the STEM resources or support for creating accessible STEM resources has cropped up a lot in the data. So it's interesting that's a theme that's developed through the data as well. So moving on, from discussions that I had with colleagues at other universities, when I asked them whether they thought the pandemic was a catalyst or a distraction, the responses are actually mixed and quite complex. This particular learning technology said it's definitely a distraction. We don't have the resources to be fully accessible whilst trying to convert ourselves from a face-to-face institution to one that delivers, for now at least, virtually everything online. The next comment from the TEL manager was that the utopian digitally accessible university will remain nothing but a dream whilst we continue to perpetuate repurposing analog content into digital systems, or to reference a presentation tomorrow, I think it's old wine, new bottles. The digital learning design here says that what else can we do but see this as an opportunity to make things better and to prove that the world doesn't end when we make rapid changes. And I think the world didn't end. It's a very good point, but I think the issue is perhaps a bit more nuanced than this. And this final quote is interesting in that it references the concept of disproportionate burden. And under the PS bar, a public sector body can claim disproportionate burden if attempting to comply with a requirement imposes a burden that's disproportionate to the outcome. So a good example of a disproportionate burden is that of human-generated captions, whereby an institution could claim that the cost of producing human-generated captions is it's too costly and it outweighs the relative benefits that they provide. And Kent itself undertook an assessment, and it does exactly this, in that it claims it would be disproportionately costly to blanket introduce human-generated captions for all of its lecture recordings. So instead, at Kent, we use automatically generated captions. And by analysing the accessibility statements on university websites, it's possible to then, as you can see here, present the data as to the proportion of institutions that are claiming disproportionate burden. Now, again, if you drill down into this, the most common disproportionate burden claims are in relation to captions, and also in relation to archived learning and teaching materials, and particular tools and websites that have perhaps in the process of being retired and going to be replaced by things in the future. So if I return to my initial question now and think about, was the global pandemic a catalyst or a distraction? Has the university, or are universities given much needed impetus to bring about real change or in digital learning and sow the seeds of a fully accessible digital experience? Or conversely, has it sapped the resources and focus of already depleted teams and forced institutions down a route of just looking to automate and systematize digital accessibility? I would probably argue that it's from both points of view. I think it's a combination of the two, is my opinion. I think the PS bar has rightfully focused our attention on digital accessibility, and I think that laid the groundwork for what then followed. I think that's a really good thing. And the data shows that the majority of institutions have reacted to accelerate their support for digital accessibility in response to the pandemic. In addition to that, the data also shows that institutions have invested hundreds of thousands of pounds to introduce systems and processes to support digital accessibility. And we can also see that there is an upward trend and that there is wider levels of engagement from academic staff, which again, these are all really positive things. But we also need to remember that students do continue to report issues, and there are students that who still feel that they are actually less supported now than they were prior to the pandemic. And academic staff still seem to be unaware of their responsibilities in this process. And perhaps this message is just getting lost amongst the noise of absolutely everything else they need to do as practitioners. Personally, and as I've argued strongly here, I think we've developed something of an over-reliance on the automation of accessibility. And it's not the fault of that technology, but it does nudge us down a path of box ticking and forgetting that content creation is a human process. And I'd also argue that there really is a lack of clarity around the regulations. It's taken sector-wide working groups to help interpret aspects of the legislation, which makes it so much harder for institutions to implement it. And there continues to be this perception that digital accessibility is for the few. I've heard so many academic staff say, well, this doesn't apply to me because I don't have any visually impaired students on my module. And that's the kind of discourse that we want to put an end to. I think a lot of this can be addressed with better and more meaningful communication. But the challenge of good communication is always getting to people to listen. So to conclude, I would say that the global pandemic, if it truly is a catalyzing event, then we need to stop thinking of digital accessibility as something that we're just obliged to do. Our systems, our resources, and our processes, they need to be born accessible. If they're born digital, then they need to be born accessible as well. And people need to take an active responsibility in the content that they create as content creators. So I think that's me done. I hope I'm bang on time. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that's been useful. And yeah, I think we've probably got a couple of minutes for questions, hopefully.
Yeah, I think it's more than you have been really good with the timing, Dan, really in time. So we have some minutes for questions, and I can see the people from the chat were engaging that. If you please can address any specific questions to Dan through the chat, or if you wanna, I think Martin, they can use the microphone, the audience in this session, so feel free.
Well, whilst you're doing that, I can see that Alex Spears has posted a comment about that automation, the solution of automation was perhaps only realistic because the response to glacial change in HE. And I would agree with that. I think automation, I don't argue that it's a bad thing. I think automation needs to be, it's part of a suite of approaches, and that I think the speed of change in HE is very slow at times, and the automation of processes and systems, I think, filled that void, because otherwise nothing would ever happen. So yeah, I guess I'm not having a go at automation. I think it's a natural thing to fill that void in what we probably can all agree is HE sometimes dragging its feet a little bit. Certainly at Kent. I'm talking from a Kent point of view there. Having a look for other questions. I'm not sure. Can people unmute their mics, or I can't remember whether that's possible in this session.
Yes, if people want to use the microphone.
Comments from some of the participants then regarding the confusion around captions, and within the management, I think they were up in the chat if you wanna take.
Well, there's the captions are something of a real headache. I think this is something that the whole sector is grappling with, because there is, and I talked about lack of clarity from the Government Digital Service. We have heard recently that the Government Digital Service have effectively said, well, if your automated captions aren't 100% accurate, then you are not compliant. And the risk of that is that the universities and public sector bodies will simply say, right, we're going to claim disproportionate burden. And I think that's a really negative consequence. I think we need to work, and we are working with the GDS, but it's a dialogue that we need to have with them, because we need to better understand what their expectations are around these regulations. And captions is a prime example of where we don't have the clarity that we need. We use Panopto, and the captioning engine on Panopto is pretty good, but it does at times throw up some absolute nightmare transcriptions, and that does erode the confidence in that technology. And when you're then telling the academics that they need to edit that, you know, they're not particularly happy. As a question from Michael Robinson, do you think that technologies and tools should help create accessible content? Well, I like things like the Microsoft Accessibility Checker. You know, at Kent, we've really tried to promote the Microsoft Accessibility Checker as almost like spell check. You know, you wouldn't think of sending out a Word document without spell checking. And what we would like is people just to use the Accessibility Checker, which is just as easy to use. And we're trying to instill that practice amongst our staff at Kent, in that, look, you spell check, you accessibility check, and then you've got the automation tools like Blackboard Ally, like Census Access, that can then work their wonders on that content and make it, you know, provide the content however the students want to engage with it. But, you know, we have to work from a baseline that we've got to do some of the work ourselves. Do I have time for any further questions, Marie?
I think there are two final remarks in the chat. We conclude with that. Oh, sorry, Martin, or maybe not.
I think it's lovely to see so much interest in your work and the comments you're saying, but I think we also have to give our next presenters their allocated time.
Of course, people are very welcome to email me on that address. So thanks very much, everyone.
Yes, thanks, Martin, and thanks to Dan for